Hey everybody, it's been a little while since I worked on this grinder, but I'm hoping I can wrap things up. I did spend a little bit of time rewiring this. Getting this all rewired was not that difficult, thanks in part to the fact that I made very detailed notation of how the things were put together. This is a wiring diagram. I even notated exactly how the drum switch actuates. So forward, off, and reverse. And then on top of that, I also had a more literal drawing here of the actual where the wires were coming in and where the wire nuts were and things like that. And so that made it pretty easy to put this back together. I did make a couple of changes. The new capacitor is physically smaller than the old capacitor. So the old capacitor wouldn't fit inside this box, and so it had to be bolted to down here. I decided, since I have room in the box, I'm going to actually locate the capacitor inside here. But rather than make a strap for this special, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this in foam, zip tie it, and just allow it to sit inside here. And then that way, if it's rattling up against the side of the box, it won't be able to make any noise because the foam will acoustically insulate it. These wires right here, where they pass through this opening, they could rub up against this sheet metal of this makeshift box. So I'm going to wrap these to protect them. And then last, I just want to speak real quick about the whole drum switch issue. In regards to these wires where they go through here, I could just tape these up with electrical tape, but it's kind of a pain in the butt to get the electrical tape around there when they're already in there. So what I've got is I've got this material right here. I forget what they call this, but this is basically it's a plastic shield for wire looms. And the way it's made is it has this slit and it kind of snaps closed. But the idea is that since it's got this slit, you can actually open this up and place it over the wires, and then it'll close back around it. And what that'll do is that'll keep those wires inside this plastic sheath. They won't be able to touch that metal and rub up against it with the threat of abrasion of the insulation occurring over time. All right, so I wrapped this in some thin packing foam, and then wrapped that in electrical tape. That's not going to go anywhere. Kind of sits in there kind of snugly now. And then I've got that wire loom plastic shielding there, a little piece of that. That's going to protect those wires. So this is actually all set and ready to be closed up. I'm quickly learning that a lot of the screws that were in this when I took it apart were not the correct screws at all. The sheet metal screws that were in here were actually way too small. The only reason they were staying on was the cover was being pushed out by the wiring, and it was allowing the screw to catch in the oversized holes. I don't know what the heck was in here for a screw when I originally took it out, but I found a screw in my spare screws that fits really well, and because the only other one I found that fit in there was actually way too long. So I don't think that was the correct screw for that. It occurs to me that I forgot to bother cleaning this up or painting this. So I also missed this. Well, anyways. And then I just put this all back together and realized I totally forgot about the light that goes in the back here. And the wiring for that light runs down underneath and comes up into this junction box. So I'm going to have to go back in there and fix that. But I figure while I've got it all hooked up and ready to go, hopefully, I figured I'd give it a test. Now, it just occurred to me I used a plug that I had hanging around here, which has got a GFI cord end on it, which I didn't plan on. I was going to take that off, but I've got to find a 15 amp plug. This is a 20, so it's got the one blade turned to the side here, and I don't have anything here on my bench to plug that in. All right, got a new plug on there, the proper plug. I also cut this cord shorter. I had quite a bit of cord. I had about 15 feet of this cord, and this is really nice cord. It's good quality, so I'm probably going to want to use the rest of it on another machine. So never really know how long I want to cut these. I mean, you could just cut a really short one and then use an extension cord, but that's not always a great idea. Ideally, you want to plug it directly into the outlet it's going to be used in. So I'm thinking this is probably going to sit near an outside wall close enough. So I pretty much made a cord that's about long enough to reach from here down to the floor when it's on its stand. And that should also be far enough to reach an outlet at the back wall of the shop. Well, enough said about that. Let's see how I did on my wiring job. All right, it's plugged in, no sparks, that's good. And of course, you never want to try and throw it into the other, into reverse when it's still spinning. That would be bad. There's this brake that actually is on this thing. I haven't installed it yet. But that's how you would slow it down more quickly if you wanted to change direction.
Anticipation, it's making me wait.
All right. So far, so good. All right, so a few minutes ago, I started to talk about something I wanted to share with you guys, and it was regarding this forward-reverse switch. In a previous episode, I think I had alluded to the thought of maybe getting rid of this forward-reverse switch altogether. And the reason why is, well, my first thought was that this wasn't original to the machine, because of the fact that this metal box right here was clearly fabricated by somebody after the fact. There's a large hole right here in the base that looks like it might have held a switch. And with this in its position that it's in right now, it completely obscures this data plate here on the motor, which is original. So that's another clue that this is not the way this was supposed to be. So my thinking was this box shouldn't even be here and that we should have a switch just down here and that would be the end of it. However, upon doing a little bit of research on these grinders and realizing that this is in fact a tool cutter grinder, and unlike a traditional pedestal grinder where the grinding actually happens on this face here, we're actually grinding on this face. And the way that the tables, which I don't have installed on here yet, the way the tables work, the tables are mounted on this post, which is round, specifically so that the table is able to tilt in this axis, kind of like this, okay? And also, it can tilt like this. So you can tilt it at an angle like this and give you a compound angle. Not unlike the angles often found on lathe tool bits when you're grinding them, which makes this a perfect tool for doing something like that. Well, if you think about it, you're always going to want to be grinding this with the wheel, the surface of the wheel going down towards the table, pushing the item that you're grinding firmer onto the table, if that makes sense. So here's the thing. If we tilt it like this, and we tilt it like this, we might have the angle we want over here. But there might be instances where we'd rather, maybe we've got a long piece, and the way that we're holding it on the table, instead of grinding on this face right here, we might want to grind over here on this side. Well, the problem is, if we do not have a forward-reverse switch, then if the grinder is always going in this direction, it's set up for grinding on this side, but then when we go to grind over here, it's going in the wrong direction. Enter the forward-reverse switch. So that's why a lot of these tool cutter grinders have forward-reverse switches, because of the way that they're set up. So that begs the question, what the heck's going on here then? Well, as luck would have it, when I originally searched for information on this grinder, I didn't find these photos that I just found recently, which I'm going to share with you now. So I'll put those up on the screen. So these are the photos that I found. And my grinder is clearly a Hammond Model 6. Back to my grinder for a moment. Right down here, it's embossed Hammond 6. And on the data plate back here, we already saw that there is a place where it says Model 6. So this is a Model 6 Hammond grinder. So if we go back to that photo that I found, this appears to be a fairly original Model 6 Hammond grinder. And what you can see is that it does in fact have a forward-reverse drum switch, but the drum switch is just mounted much lower because it's mounted on what almost appears to be a couple of BX armored cables that come up through a plate that would cover that large hole that we saw in the casting of my grinder. So that tells me that we're on the right track here as far as having a forward reverse switch on this grinder. It's just that somebody modified my grinder by adding this housing, which raises the switch up higher, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So anyways, that's where we stand. All right, so I just screwed the light gooseneck back onto the post in the back here, and I was looking at this end of the light up here, and there is all this gnarly electrical tape. So I'm wondering what's going on up here. I'm probably going to not like what I find underneath this tape, but nevertheless I'm going to investigate and see what its purpose is. I'm hoping that this isn't completely broken off and just held on here by tape. Okay, that tape appears to have been utterly pointless. I do not know why on earth they had that all taped up. There's nothing, doesn't appear to be anything broken. All right. So this switch and this light seem to be working perfectly fine. This cap's loose. The wiring looks intact though. So I'm going to just roll with that the way it is. I'm not going to mess with that. And the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to upgrade it, and we're going to find an LED bulb that'll fit in there. And the LED bulb will give us plenty of good working light, and more importantly, it'll run really cool, so that if you want to grab this and move it around, you don't have to worry about burning your hand. Maybe that's what the tape was for. Yeah, I don't know. All right, I'm going to actually going to knock off at this point here. I mounted this casting back on, mounted the brake back on, realized I've got to take this wheel off of this side and move it over to here, because this side is where this wheel originally was, because that's what the brake has to actuate on. This side, for those of you who haven't been watching the entire series or don't remember way back in episode 1, this side is the side of the grinder that was completely bastardized, and somebody had probably originally broken this casting off and made a shield to put on here. The table was missing, and they had actually used some metal shims to bush a oversized, a standard grinding wheel with an oversized hole in it to run on there, and who knows how true that was going to run. I mean, I don't remember when I first tested this thing how well that was running. But we're going to put this back to more like the original. Luckily, in the estate where I bought this out of, after I bought the grinder, was going through some other drawers, and in a file cabinet of all places, or under a bench, I forgot where, was able to pull out the original missing tables. So I do have 2 tables for this grinder, and we're gonna see if we can't mount another correct wheel on this side.